Welcome to Avenue M. My name is Joey Taylor.
And I am Haroon Mogul.
We're two men on a journey of faith and meaning. In each episode, we sit down with a remarkable guest to unpack the moments that shape us, the struggles that build us, and the questions that intrigue us. Today's guest is Shaul Magid. When we reached out to Shaul, Professor of Modern Jewish Studies at Harvard Divinity School, there was no ceasefire. While we address the ceasefire, the substance of our conversation includes and extends well beyond current events, because we believe the moment calls for a different kind of conversation and a different kind of podcast. At the end of this powerful conversation, we include an update, an evolution here at Avenue M, which we believe gets us closer to the goal that's been driving us all along, to create a space to have deep, ongoing conversations about meaning, about faith, about what this moment asks of us, and about how we might be true to our callings and convictions.
Ceasefire. Do you think it's going to hold?
Ceasefire. I think the ceasefire will hold for now. I don't think it's the end of... I don't think it's the end of the war. It's very interesting that Trump said the war is over and Netanyahu said the war is not over. So I'm not sure exactly. I would actually believe Netanyahu more than Trump on that particular point. But I think it'll hold because I think on some level both sides really wanted it. And I think that Trump use that opportunity, that window of opportunity to kind of push both sides over the edge. But I think that it was very clear that the Israeli population was really had reached its limit on the hostage question, and less so to the war question, which I'll mention a little bit more. And I think Hamas wanted it to end too on some level. So I think the ceasefire will probably hold for the time being.
So here we are now, just over 2 years into what has been, I think, inarguably the most catastrophic conflict in the history of a dispute, a conflict that goes back decades. And undoubtedly it has changed a lot of communities and a lot of perceptions. I know that in American Muslim communities and in global Muslim communities, there have been some really hard conversations about what this moment means, what it reveals, where we go next, what our place may be in different conversations, institutions. One of the reasons we reached out to you is because we wanted to understand from your perspective what's happening in Jewish communities, not just in the United States, not just in Israel, but between and within those communities as well. So I wanted to start with this. How do you think the last 2 years have affected the conversation around Jewishness in the United States?
I know this is going to sound somewhat hyperbolic, but I'll try to substantiate it. I think that the consequence of the last 2 years is that I could start with American Jewry and then move on from there, but I think American Jewry is broken and maybe irreparably broken. It's really a Humpty Dumpty type of situation. I think that the Zionist consensus of American Jewry has ended. I think it's collapsed. I think the middle, meaning that the middle has collapsed, the kind of standard liberal Zionist narrative is treading water. And American Jewry has really moved both to the right, and you see that in terms of the political right, in terms of the support for Trump, and that's going to rise now after this. And it's moved very far to the left. And I think there's a substantial constituency of American Jews who have basically concluded that the Zionist project is a failure. And whether they just disavow their relationship to Israel and go on and living their lives as diaspora Jews, or whether they take a kind of anti-Zionist stance is remains to be seen. And probably both of those are true. But I don't think there has been any event in the history of American Jewry, and that goes back 300 years, that has had such a divisive impact on American Jews. I don't mean American Jews as individuals. I mean as a collective.
As a collective. So I have a lot of deeper questions, but I have a few questions that, if you'll indulge me, I'd like to unpack, because I think it's important for this conversation. As I think we all know, there are not a lot of sophisticated conversations about what's happening, where there's moral clarity, but also willingness to confront the messiness and the complexity of what could happen next. And so I wanted to ask, as a first clarifying question, when you say the liberal Zionist narrative, what does that mean?
So the liberal Zionist narrative, in a nutshell, is basically makes a particular set of assumptions. Number one, Israel is a Jewish and democratic country. Number two, it's essentially a liberal country. Number three, that the occupation of the West Bank and the Gaza Strip is something that's temporary and will eventually be solved. There'll be a solution to the problem of the occupation. And number four, that the result of that solution will be the establishment of an independent Palestinian state. That is kind of the standard liberal Zionist template. And that has really, in a certain sense, been dominant in American Zionism since the 1970s. I think that almost all of those premises are, if not destabilized, have now been invalidated as a result of this. Now, what's going to come in the future, I have no idea. I can just speak from where I am in October 2025.
Can I interject, Haroon? Is that okay? I mean,
Absolutely.
I would just love to hear just a little bit from your own perspective. I know you're not talking about the collapse of your own Judaism in the context of this conflict, but how are you personally making sense of this moment in terms of your own Jewishness?
Well, I mean, I stopped becoming a Zionist many years ago. I stopped becoming a Zionist after I served in the IDF. I mean, my personal firsthand experience of what occupation is and what domination is really led me to realize that that what was happening, and this is my own personal view, right? That what was happening in what I saw in the West Bank was not an aberration, but it was actually a continuation of a particular stream of Zionism that has become dominant. And there were other streams of Zionism. There were paths not taken. There were things that could have been done throughout the history of the Zionist project going back to the early 20th century. But those decisions were not made for a variety of reasons, some of them having to do with those involved and some of them having to do with history itself. I mean, the rise of Nazism, the collapse of Europe, the fact that Zionism went from being one option among many to being an emergency of saving as many lives as possible, all of those things. So I don't want to blame it all on the Zionists per se, but there were decisions that were made and there were roads that were taken, and this is where we are. So I think that for me personally, my own Jewishness, my own Jewish identity, and my own sense of being a part of this, 3,000-year-old, 2,500-year-old wisdom tradition is distinct from this particular Jewish nationalist project that's about a century old. And I think that there's something that I find to be troubling, that somehow this particular project has superseded a much longer, complex tradition that I still feel very much a part of.
So I have a question, and I'll try to maybe break it down in terms that I've experienced as a Muslim. So in American Muslim communities, there's kind of two larger demographic strands. There's Black Muslims, African American Muslims, who, depending on who you ask and the history, the kind of threads you follow, have at a minimum been Muslim communities for decades, possibly centuries, certainly going back to the early period of the transatlantic slave trade. That's one big segment of the community. The other, often called Muslims of recent immigrant origin, immigrant heritage, what have you, mostly Middle Eastern and South Asian like myself. I'm, of course, more familiar with the latter. And in a lot of our communities, I think in the first generation, right, in the first few decades, there was this feeling that we were kind of dislocated or temporarily located in the United States or in Canada, the UK, Australia, what have you, but that really genuine life and the future lay somewhere else. That at some point we would go back to Pakistan or Egypt or what have you. We would resume life there. This was kind of a layover, for lack of a better term. It was the children who were raised here, people like myself, I'm now in my 40s, who realized very quickly that this was home, that we didn't really have a connection to the places our parents came from, except ancestrally. And so there was a kind of break, a rupture, that Sherman Jackson, who's a scholar of Islam based at, I believe, USC, framed it this way, that home is not where your grandparents come from, it's where your grandkids will grow up. And that reanimated a lot of Muslim communities and efforts. Some of that, I think, is very much up in the air at the moment, but I'll come back to that. For us, the Muslim world is sort of seen as, and when I say Muslim world, Muslim majority world, as kind of a place where some of our default beliefs might be more mainstream or taken seriously, but not really a place that we have much to do with, right? And given that, I'm wondering if you can unpack, you used a term diaspora. How does that play out? Because sometimes when I hear these conversations, it almost sounds as if there is, and I'm not trying to impose a meaning, I'm just trying to discern a meaning, that there are, that to be Jewish outside of Israel has a different kind of valence or status than it is to be, for example, in another place. Does that make sense?
Yes, certainly. I think when we talk about, when we use the term Judaism or the Jewish tradition, we're talking about, certainly the way it exists in the 21st century, we're talking about a diasporic religion. I mean, the way in which Jews live their Judaism today was created in the diaspora as a result of the destruction of the Jerusalem temple in 70 CE. We're not living the lives of the people who were living during the times of the Jerusalem temple, bringing sacrifices and so on and so forth. And we don't even really know a whole lot about what their lives were like. So we're living a diasporic existence. And that diasporic existence had within it the aspiration of restoration, that at some point in time, the Jews would return to the land of Israel. The temple would be rebuilt. I mean, that's part of the redemptive vision. And there really wasn't a lot of, attention put into returning to the land. I'm talking about historically, returning to the land without the construction of the temple and the Messianic era. That was something that just didn't exist. I mean, Jews travel to the land of Israel many times to die or to visit certain kinds of sites. But in general, there wasn't a sense that there would be a restoration of Jews in the land of Israel that wasn't somehow connected to the Messiah and the restoration of the Jerusalem temple. That changed in the 19th century. So there were 19 centuries. There was a long time where that was just the reality, right? I mean, the land of Israel was the land of promise. It was the land of the future. It was the land of restoration. But Jews were living in the diaspora. That was their home. That was their place. They built communities there. They created a, creative, tradition, literary tradition and ritual tradition. And then at some point, there was this movement that was really in many ways driven by the rise of European nationalism. So, I mean, I really do think that Zionism as a movement is a branch of a European nationalism. When, Ernst Renan in 1892 wrote this famous essay, What is a Nation? And when the German philosopher Fichte earlier started giving, his addresses to the German people, and Jews started to actually kind of absorb this national ethos and apply it to themselves, in part because they felt that they were not able to fully integrate into European society as a result of the emancipation. So, it's very interesting that Anita Shapiro has this book called Land and Power on the history of Zionism and force. And the first sentence of the book is that the Zionist movement began with a disappointment. And the disappointment is that the emancipation wasn't going to work, that the Jews were not going to be able to become part of European society. And so they took upon themselves the idea to say, well, let's actually create a nationalism for ourselves. And in a certain way, that's how Zionism was born. And then it becomes merged with the aspirations of return that existed throughout the tradition. So you have that kind of combination of the aspiration and the reality, except the difference is that the reality did not align itself with the messianic aspiration of return, restoration, the construction of a temple, and so on and so forth. And there we are. So, but to your question, I still think Jews, especially in America, and America is a very particular kind of case, and I'd be interested to hear from you how America is for Muslims in relationship to other diasporic places that they live. For the Jews, the American experiment was considered to be that which they had been waiting for in some level. It was a place where they were able to exist as a community and worship freely. I mean, it goes back to George Washington's 1791 letter to the Jews in the Touro Synagogue in Rhode Island of saying, yes, you can come here and you can be a part of the experiment, not as individual Jews, the way it was in France, but as a collective. And so you have this movement in America of America becomes the new promised land. And then when Zionism emerges, there's a very strong pushback among a lot of American Jewish leaders against it, because it brought into the conversation questions of dual allegiance. Where do you really belong? Where is your allegiance? Are you an American? Are you not an American? You know, are you a American Jew versus Jewish American? That's actually kind of interesting, right? American Jews generally see themselves as American Jews, not Jewish Americans. So that the adjective is really American and not Jew, where you have Muslim Americans. I don't know whether Muslim American is more popular than American Muslim. In any event, I think that's kind of the story. But it then, in a certain way, again, it's then the collapse of Europe, the rise of Hitler kind of changes everything, where the destabilization, the fear, the skepticism becomes so highly charged that Israel as a country becomes a miracle. It's kind of how it's understood, and then begins to overshadow everything.
It's an interesting question. I think for American Muslims, of course, an incredibly complex and diverse community, so I can't begin to speak with any kind of generalization, but I'll say for myself, I grew up in a community of maybe 15 to 20 families. It was a very small Muslim community in Western Massachusetts. And when you have a small community, then there's a certain level of intimacy and trust and a lot of naivete that comes with that. So the first time I spent any real amount of time on my own in a Muslim majority country was in Saudi Arabia. It was 1998 after I'd graduated from college. And my brother was working in Jeddah on the western coast of Saudi Arabia. He was there during law school working for a law firm. And he invited me to join him for a month. And we'd do the minor pilgrimage to Mecca. And we'd visit Medina, the Muslim holy cities. And I believe that in my mind, and it sounds hopelessly ridiculous now when I think back on it, that this was going to be some kind of turbocharged version of my American Muslim community. It would be a place where suddenly I wouldn't be an outsider, I wouldn't be strange, I wouldn't be weird, I wouldn't be different, and the things that I was taught were the most important would be the most important things. And so I arrive in Saudi Arabia and very quickly find myself in a society that is, well, like a lot of other societies. It has crime, and it has bigotry and bias and prejudice, it has elites, it has you want to say the marginalized, those who are doing better, those who are doing worse. Obviously, in many respects, it was a formative experience. I got to be in and worship at the holiest sites of my faith tradition, and to suddenly find myself a part of a truly global community. So I'm not discounting that in the least. Nevertheless, within a month, I walked away realizing that that's not my home. I don't belong there. And frankly, I don't believe I would be perceived to be belong there either, that it was a reciprocal sense of difference, that I am not a Saudi Arabian and never will be, and I would not be seen as a Saudi Arabian and never will be. And that's fine. That religion is not meant to be particular to any one ethnicity or location or geography, and I'm meant to be in the United States, and I went to New York City and went to college, and my life proceeded from there, from that moment. I will say that this moment, these last 2 years, have been decisive in the trajectory of American Muslims and probably Muslim communities around the world, because there's never really been anything like it. On the one hand, no one's ever experienced this kind of imagery on such a constant basis, that from kids I teach who are 12, 13 years old, they're being exposed to images of atrocities on their phones, social media, that they can't really make sense of. Then if they're told that if they speak out about it, that there can be consequences for that. And then on top of it, it doesn't really seem to fit into anything that makes sense to them from even the perspective of American politics. So if we look back in my life at the Iraq War, for example, the Afghanistan War, one could say, I'm not justifying the Iraq War. I think it was a war pursued under false pretenses, but it came out of a post 9/11 environment. In this case, a lot of young American Muslims are saying, well, this doesn't even have anything to do with us. It's nothing to do with America. It didn't happen to Americans. Why are we so enmeshed in this? And from college students to folks who work in different professional spaces, the months after October 7th were subjected to all kinds of harassment, abuse, doxing, none of which gets talked about, right? There were no congressional hearings. There were no opportunities to talk about what it was like to be an American Muslim, Arab American, Palestinian American. And so it has pushed people to ask really hard questions. What gives me a measure of hope right now is that what I've seen from young people is a willingness to build bridges with other communities and to try to find a way forward that is capable of alliance and relationship and connection that counts on shared values. I think people often knock Zohran Mamdani. I'm coming at this as a middle-class, suburban, middle-aged American Muslim who probably wouldn't ordinarily be advocating freezing rent. But when I look at him and what he represents, it does give me a measure of pride and a measure of optimism, because that didn't have to be the way people chose to respond. They could have become insular. They could have become depressed. And I think there are elements of that in every American Muslim right now, for sure. Alongside that, there is a commitment to doing more. But I think what I want to come back to, but Joey, I know you have a question, so I'm going to let you go. And I've also been talking for a long time. But what I want to come back to is that I think that there are these deep structural changes happening within a lot of faith communities in America right now, what those mean, and how we can push those forward in ways that are good for our own communities and good for the United States. But Joey, I'm gonna give it over to you.
I'm happy to ask a question. I have one ready, but Shaul, before I do, I very much appreciated hearing what you just said. So I just want to give Shaul space to respond to that if anything struck him from what you said.
I think it's a very good point. One of the things that I think is emerging among American Jews, certainly young American Jews on the left, is a renewed sense of solidarity as a path toward an expression of Jewishness. And part of that comes from Occupy, part of it comes from BLM, and part of it comes from the Gaza war. I think those three moments, a lot of American Jews who are in their early 30s now, they rose up into sentient political existence through Occupy and through BLM. And I think that the Gaza war is another iteration of that. And the major difference is, for example, the Jews who were involved in the New Left in the 1960s, anti-Vietnam, civil rights, they were doing it as secular, assimilated American Jews. A lot of the Jews who are now engaged in a pro-Palestinian solidarity or protest against the war are doing it as ritually enhanced Jews. In other words, that there are Passover seders at the encampments. In other words, there's expressing solidarity from a place of a renewed sense of Jewishness. And I think that's something that's new. And I think it's something that in some way drives the institutional Jewish world crazy, because they don't know what to do with that. They know what to do with an assimilated Jew who becomes a progressive leftist, right? Socialist, right? Woke, whatever you want to say. It's harder for them to really absorb or digest the Jew who is an observant ritual Jew who sees their observance as being an expression of their solidarity with people who are in a state of distress. And obviously, the Muslim world was in a state of distress. I mean, Gaza was in a state of distress. So I think that's part of the change that's happening. And I think those are the seedlings that are emerging out of the collapse of the consensus, in my view. But go ahead, Joey.
Well, yeah, so I wanted to ask a question about the project that you're working on now in terms of the prominence of exile. And could you differentiate diaspora from exile? Is one descriptive and one prescriptive? I would just love to get into that orientation.
Sure. So the main difference for me is that exile is basically a geographical descriptor, dispersion, people who are living outside of their homeland. And Jews have been doing that for a very long time. Exile is really a more existential category. It's about the fact that history is not over, the fact that Jewish history is not over, the fact that the Jewish story is not over. And in a certain sense, that creates at least I argued in the book, right? That creates an ethos of generosity and an ethos of caring for others and an ethos of, in a certain sense, perfecting the world or making the world a better place. Once you move into the post-exilic world, which some people, in Israel claim that, Zionism is the end of exile, that's a very dangerous place because chauvinism, domination, everything very easily, not necessarily and inevitably, but something very easily kind of seeps in. So when I talk about exile, I'm not only talking about it as a diasporic phenomenon, I'm talking about what it is to live in the land in exile. That actually the story continues, the process continues, it's not over yet, and the work has to be done in order to create a world that can contain the kind of solidarity and unity that ultimately is the aspiration of redemption. So in a certain sense, exile becomes the opposite of redemption. And redemption, messianism, redemption, as Gershom Shalom taught us, is a very, very dangerous thing. It's very dangerous to think that it has become actualized, and it's also very dangerous to erase it completely. So it's really, the exile is that middle space. As that's how I try to depict it.
Yeah, I love that. I'm coming from a Christian perspective and have been influenced by people like John Howard Yoder and folks from kind of the Anabaptist sort of tradition. And in the way that you talk about exile, I hear a lot of connection, a lot of synergy. The idea of in Jeremiah working for the well-being of the city that you're living in, as opposed to trying to find some far-off place that could eventually provide everything that you need. The one question that I have for you in terms of how you're constructing exile is, I feel like with the Jewish people who I love and who are in my life, the concern about safety and existential safety is just so paramount. And so how do you conceive of safety within the context of exile?
It's a good question. I by the way, I'm also a big fan of Yoder, and I wrote an essay on Yoder and another contemporary Jewish philosopher, Peter Oakes, who was criticizing Yoder on questions of supersessionism. Anyway, that's for another time. I think exile contains a kind of inherent sense of insecurity. I think that's part of its nature. And I think that's also part of its power, because it's that sense of insecurity which cultivates generosity and an ethics of care. I think that security, we all want security. I mean, we all want physical security. We want security for our families, but security has its a downside because it really becomes a foundation of power. And so I think that we live in that sense of insecurity, and in the sense that we don't want to feel like we are in danger, but we don't want to actually feel so secure that we can exercise certain amounts of power and power over others. So I think that's, and in a certain sense that has always been the challenge of Zionism, and the Zionists back in the teens and the 20s, they knew that. They realized that. One of the things that I think a lot of people don't realize is that a lot of those people in the teens and the 20s who were Zionists experienced World War I. They saw the destruction that nations can bring about. They saw the decimation of Europe, they saw the mass death, and they were very cautious about nationalism and what nationalism can do. And I think they felt that many of them anyway felt that there was a potential there within the Jewish national project to actually build something different. So I think, one of the particular anti-Zionist figure that I work on, Aaron Shmuel Tamaris, he says that the biggest detriment of being, quote, like all the other nations is being like all the other nations. And in a certain sense, the fact that many of the Zionists wanted to be like all the other nations was for him the biggest problem. So, but again, history intervenes, Hitler comes to power, Europe falls apart, like everything collapses, and all of that gets like pushed off the table. And I think in a certain sense, we're living in the aftermath of that. And, I think some of us are trying to revive an earlier project, but a lot of those people in the teens and 20s, certainly that I identify with and that I study, who considered themselves Zionists would no longer be considered Zionists today, because most of them were opposed to a Jewish state.
So I want to pick up on something here, because I mentioned a trip to Saudi Arabia in 1998, and I come back to the United States, and I'm at New York University. I throw myself into student life. It's fun to be in Manhattan. It's a very different experience. It's a new experience. It's a very unique part of the United States and certainly the world. And then 9/11 happens. And I find myself thrust into a position where me, a very introverted human being, is being asked to speak on and speak to these huge questions about the world, which I might have a limited amount of fluency in, but certainly not enough to speak competently or even at times coherently. And that's one of the reasons why I went to graduate school. And I found myself in graduate school consumed by the question of partition and the emergence of Muslim nationalism in South Asia. My family was very active in the Pakistan movement many decades ago. Ancestrally, my family is of a scholarly lineage going back many generations. There's a family tree that goes back centuries, and effectively, we've always had a kind of place within larger Indo-Islamic South Asia. And partition happens, and I could have asked myself 10,000 different ways, should this have happened? Could it have been avoided? What were the different options? And in a similar sense, World War II accelerated the timetable that had World War II not happened, again, counterfactuals, would the British have withdrawn when they did, how they did? Would it have happened in the same way? Nehru and Gandhi are in prison. South Asian men are being mobilized in huge numbers. They come home. Suddenly they have the ability to form militia, and that, again, the whole thing sort of falls apart, and the British walk away, run away, exhausted, complicit, however you want to look at it. And these 2 and eventually 3 countries are born. And at some point I realized to myself, well, I don't live there, so I can't speak to these questions with any kind of direct stake. And for me as an American, then, to presume that I have the right to speak to them, there's a certain level of, I don't know what we want to call it, a superiority complex, a sense of entitlement, what have you. But I think what underlies it for me is this sense that when religion becomes enmeshed in a political project, it becomes very dangerous, right? And that's not to say that political projects can't be dangerous to religions either, right? It was not good to be a religious minority in India. It was not good to be a religious minority in Pakistan in many different respects. And in many respects, that's still true today. My question is, and I want to get personal here because I want to come back to this bigger question. You said that you went to Israel, you served in the IDF, and a sort of process of transformation happens, right? To walk us through that, what that looks like, and where you stand now. And I know I have a lot of questions, so I'll stop there, but I'd like to understand that process.
Okay, so I'll begin. Like, I wasn't raised, and here I'm a bit somewhat anomalous. I was not raised in a Zionist home per se. I don't think I heard the word Zionism until I was probably in 12th grade. My family come from what's called the workman's circle. They were Bundists, they were socialists. I went to a socialist summer camp that was not, we never had Israeli flags. It was a Jewish summer camp, but we never had Israeli flags. We didn't speak Hebrew. So I don't come with a lot of baggage. And I went to Israel because I was searching for some kind of spiritual alternative lifestyle. I didn't go to Israel because of Zionism. I didn't go to Israel because of the state. I went to Israel because it was the land of Israel. And it was there that I kind of entered into a kind of ultra-Orthodox world that really had nothing whatsoever to do with Zionism at all. In fact, it was quite anti-Zionist, but I didn't really pay much attention to it. I was just interested in, I was just interested in living a kind of alternative, countercultural spiritual life. And at a certain point, I became somewhat disillusioned with that for a variety of reasons. And I discovered this new world that was just emerging, which was the kind of settler movement. This is in the 80s and early 80s. And there was something that was incredibly romantic about that movement, whereas the ultra-Orthodox world I was living in was actually trying to conserve the past. The settler movement was looking to the future. And I just felt that there was some kind of future-oriented spiritual project that I became, very attached to or sucked into, until I started to realize, and I'm coming from, being a liberal American, growing up in the New York suburbs, I started to realize that it was actually quite romantic and it was future oriented, but it didn't really have a place for the Palestinian population. The Palestinians were kind of in the way. Like history was moving forward for them, for the settlers, and the Palestinians were in the way, and eventually, God will work it all out, kind of, so I growing up as a liberal American, I couldn't really accept that. What ended up happening is that since God didn't really work it out, there was more agency, it became more violent and so on, and we see how it's kind of like unfolded over the last number of decades. So I felt like I had to leave that world too. So I'm kind of moving in one world, moving in out of another world, and I decided to come back to America really to go to graduate school. I mean, I moved to Israel. I lived there for 10 years. I never thought I would leave. I became an Israeli citizen, served in the army, had 3 kids there. And then I realized that in some weird way I felt, and I know this may be kind of somewhat audacious, I feel like the country spit me out. Like I felt like more and more alienated from the project, but still very committed to the tradition, committed to the life, committed to the spiritual project. And so what does someone do when they do that? They become an academic and then they study it. So it's like it's kind of like the perfect out, right, in a certain way. And then, I realized that my life experience really offered me a certain set of tools and experiences, but also tools to be able to kind of more carefully analyze what was happening and how things were developing. And, we first met at the Shalom Hartman Institute, right? So I became part of that, which is a liberal Zionist, institute, because somehow I still fit there. I hadn't really abandoned that yet. I was still hanging on to the possibility that could work. And after the war began it was like the spring of 2024, I couldn't be there anymore, and I resigned because I felt like there was something that was deeply hypocritical and disingenuous with an attempt to justify the mass death that was happening. And as I said to you, I think I really lost my Zionism, so to speak, in the IDF when I was serving in around Shechem, around Nablus, and really walking around, and I'm sure a lot of soldiers experience this and digest it in different ways. But when you're walking around as a soldier in full army gear with a loaded gun, and you see the hatred in the eyes of children toward you, like I had never experienced that as a liberal American growing up, that kind of hatred. And you realize, yeah, if I was them, I would hate me too, right? I'm ruling their lives. I'm imprisoning their brothers and fathers. I mean, I'm walking through their villages and their kasbah and their, where they live. And it just didn't make any sense to me. It just really started to not make any sense to me. But again, the as I said earlier, right, the liberal Zionist template is, oh yes, this is a temporary situation, this is going to work itself out, so on and so forth. And then I started to realize, actually no, it's really not going to work itself out. This has become a kind of status quo. This has become a norm. It has become a state of management, and I didn't feel like it could be a part of it anymore.
I got one, but everyone, you want to say something?
No, you can go ahead.
Okay. Thanks so much for sharing that. I think that that narrative piece really helps to frame how you've come to where you're at now. The thing that I keep coming back to this frame of exile, so I'm going to return there for just a second. The prophet Jeremiah is the person that I think of most kind of definitively when I think of the framing of exile. And I would love to hear you talk just a little bit about what is the distinction between acquiescing to empire versus living faithfully in exile. Like, how do you make sure that you're living in a way that is true to some of those moral convictions that you're kind of implying within that story, within the larger frame of exile, instead of just kind of giving in to the dominant status quo that the empire offers?
That's a great question. And for your listeners, I really want to suggest listening to a very short interview that Peter Beinart did on a Substack with Ismar Shorish, who was the chancellor of the Jewish Theological Seminary for 13 years, who's now 89 years old, retired, not particularly a lefty, very much of a centrist, very much of a Zionist. And in that interview, and this is why it reminded me, Joey, of what you said, in that interview, he said that, he called the war a desecration of God's name, right? And he said that the Hebrew term would be Chilul Hashem. And he said that we've forgotten the prophets, right? Jews have to go back and read the prophets. And it was very, very fascinating because he was right. The prophets were really actually anarchists. They were opposed to a state, any state. And they, of course, wanted Jews to be safe and wanted Jews to flourish, but they were very much in opposition to the acquiescence to state power and to the abuse of state power, the way it was done by the king and the way it was in terms of acquiescence to the Roman Empire. So I think that's part of what he meant. And when people talk about, I don't know, I'm sure everybody's seen all of the, fanfare around Trump in Israel now, in terms of all of a sudden he's like Alexander the Great, Cyrus the Great, Alexander the Great, right? That's what people are saying there. I said to a friend, well, the prophets would actually have disagreed. Like, you don't acquiesce to that power. You actually fight truth to power. And you have to fight for what you think is right, and you have to fight for the moral position that you hold. And yes, sometimes you have to acquiesce in some sense to some degree, but this whole idea of Trump, it kind of reminds, like when I was watching all of that Trump stuff, it was like he was like Caesar, right? He was like the Roman Empire. And I can remind all of your listeners, like, acquiescing to the Roman Empire did not end well for the Jews, right? Or Benjamin Netanyahu calling Israel Sparta. Sparta did not last. Sparta was destroyed, right? So I think that there's a real way that I do think that Jews, we need to return to the prophets. We need to return to that kind of strong, revolutionary, moral project, which is not going to allow itself to be corrupted by power. But again, the notion of an existential crisis, which is kind of like the ongoing way in which this perennial existential crisis really prevents that. Because if you're in a true state of existential crisis, then there is no morality. If somebody has a gun to your head, there's no morality. And I think that the danger of seeing yourself in that state constantly, perennially, really absolves you from any kind of moral obligation, and then everybody just becomes the enemy.
Joey, you're illuminating something that I'm going through and I'm struggling with, and this comes back to the last 2 years. For myself, what's happening in Gaza is a genocide. I wrote about it as such going back many months ago, and I got some blowback for it. I lost some conversations and connections, but I held to it because I thought that from my understanding and plenty of other folks, that's what's happening, and I wanted to speak out against it, but I also wanted to make sense of what the moment called me to do. And I found myself moving in a leftwards direction in ways that I wouldn't have expected years before, but a lot of things are in the air. And I guess I'll try to answer what you said, Joey, because I think it's genuinely important. So, and then I want to hear how you balance this, the two, acquiescence and exile, I suppose, if that's the way we're looking at it. I think that when I look back, maybe I was a little bit too naive about where we were as Americans in one respect, that I have been horrified by what we've been okay with at a political level. At the same time, however, I'll say that it seems like a majority of Americans are not okay with what's happening. And actually, to me, this is not separable from what's happening in the United States domestically either, insofar as one of the big problems we have as a country is that a lot of us want a certain outcome or don't want a certain policy, and yet there's no way to translate that into actual policy, right? So most Americans, for example, seem to think that some form of health insurance is a good idea, and yet we can't seem to get there. Most Americans don't want premiums to go up and presumably don't want there to be a shutdown because they think that certain kinds of coverage are reasonable and dignified and necessary. Most Americans do want gun control in some way, shape, or form, and yet we can't seem to get any of that passed. And I think it's the same here. Most Americans do not want a kind of war without end that targets people indiscriminately, and yet here we are. And my question then for me myself is, how have we gotten ourselves into this position, and what morally is our obligation as people of faith, as human beings, whatever our respective faith traditions, to bring about a society where we can democratically translate sentiment into reality without stepping on the rights of other people in the process. And that's where I'm at right now. And to me, it's as simple as we're in a shutdown. Presumably we don't have any money, but somehow we still have ICE raids happening. We can't manage to pay for people's health care, but we can still send weapons all over the world. And that disconnect, that gap is where the problem is, but it's also where the obligation is. And I think that where I stand with a lot of other Muslim communities is in my rejection of what's happening abroad and with our resources. Where I'm hopeful is that we get into these conversations, move into these spaces with other like-minded people to bring about more positive outcomes. And I don't know if that's, and I think that's actually not incompatible with the frame that you presented, Shaul, and Joey, as you framed the question as well, because it's always provisional, right? So in the Muslim tradition, we approach the Prophet Muhammad, peace be upon him, almost asymptotically. We can never actually approximate him. If we think we've approximated him, we've ended up on the opposite end of the equation, right? You're always trying with the caveat that every effort is imperfect. And so there's always room for criticism. There is always room for debate. There's always room for doubt. There's always room for improvement. The minute we think that there is not, it's that's narcissism, that's supremacism, that's ethnocentrism, religious extremism, whatever we want to call it. So I think for me, the question in this moment is, how do we take these commitments and help them move forward in an environment, as Shaul said, that there is a countervailing narrative that is very seductive, but also very dangerous. But Joy, I'm going to throw it back to you because you started it, so you have to at least answer it.
Yeah, I mean, I don't know if I'm going to answer your question. I think the thing that I'm thinking about, both in your answer there and in Shaul's answer earlier on, is the way in which the frame of exile becomes the possibility for a relational framework across difference. I think that's what I'm like being drawn to in this conversation. If you and me and Shaul all see that actually we're not looking for redemption in some particular geopolitical state, what does it look like for us to, in the least cheesiest way possible, actually come together and figure out what does it mean to work for the good of this place that we're living in here? That's where my head's at. I don't know, Shaul.
Yeah, I think it's maybe better to frame that the opposite of exile is not redemption. The opposite of exile is certainty. And I think that, in a sense, certainty very often becomes a kind of a clarion call of religion, is certainly in a kind of fundamentalist register, whether it's Judaism, Christianity, Islam, other religions. And to live in the uncertainty, to live in the doubt, is in a way what opens up the possibility of solidarity with others who share different faith traditions. I think, and this is coming from a teacher of mine, I think that one of the great opportunities of Judaism after the Second World War, after the Holocaust, is not for Judaism to be more enclosed in on itself, but for Judaism to be more expansive, to Judaism in a sense to become a world religion. That the way in which we as Jews have a gift, as Christians and Muslims have a gift of a wisdom tradition that goes back thousands of years, to be able to create some kind of a movement of solidarity to help humanity survive. I mean, we're living on a planet that's dying. I mean, we're really living on a planet that's dying. I mean, I don't think that we realize that. You know, if you ask someone 20 years old, what are the five most crucial things that you think that we have to deal with as a civilization? Almost all of them will say climate change within the first two. If you ask somebody over 50, it won't even be on the list. I think that we're living in a dying planet, and instead of addressing that, we're actually killing each other. So I mean, I think part of that is the certainty. It's the certainty of, you know, what is chosen, what is not chosen, what is true prophecy, what is false prophecy. I mean, there were traditions that functioned and lived that way for thousands of years. I think we have to actually completely recalibrate the way we understand religion as a way to create a kind of culture of solidarity. And again, that's not happening. The rise of evangelicalism in America, the rise of fundamentalism in Judaism, the rise of Islamism. I mean, these are all kind of egregious deviants from all of those traditions. And I think that that's, you know, in a certain sense, that's the challenge. I don't want to be Pollyannish and say religion is the answer. I don't necessarily think religion is the answer, but there have been a lot of really wise people over the last 3,000 years in all of those traditions that have had something to offer. And we have to just basically go back to the treasure trove of all of those traditions to bring them together.
So I have a question for both of you based on what you just said, Shaul. And the point on 20-year-olds and climate change is very well taken. I've spent a lot of the last 5 years teaching middle and high schoolers, and one of the ways you have to acclimate yourself, I have to acclimate myself to teaching younger students when I have nothing to offer them. There's no grades, there's no certificates, there's no playing time. It's entirely voluntary. They don't have to listen to me. I can't really get them to sit down unless I really think through what it is that's animating them, is to take them more seriously. And part of the problem, I think I will say, in a lot of faith communities, and frankly in the United States today, is we don't take younger people seriously. And so I try to listen to them and see things from their perspective. And that's one of the reasons why I think my own political positions have evolved as well. That if I look at the world from their perspective, they see a reality, a country with immense amounts of wealth in which somehow we can always manage to bust the budget when it comes to some abstract national security conversation. And yet when it comes to their future, suddenly there's no money to be found. We can't transition to renewable energies. We can't invest in their education. We can't help them with healthcare. We can't help them with housing. But hey, we need to send some bunker busters to the other side of the world. Sure, not a problem. And we have to do it. And if you protest it, we'll send someone after you to punish you and penalize you. And to inhabit that is, I can't imagine exactly how that feels, but I'm sure I get a sense of it. And so this is a long way of saying that I agree with that. My question then is that what is, for people of faith, and I know that's also a very broad term, but we're people who take our faith traditions seriously and read them critically, but I think with conviction. What do you both think that we should be? What is our responsibility to our respective faith communities right now?
Joey?
Yeah. Oh, shoot, yeah. What is my responsibility to my faith community right now? Um, I think there's something here about, Shaul talked about speaking truth to power. I think the frame of power right now in the world that I grew up in is just really, really concerning for me. And I think I'm trying to figure out what does it mean to use the relationships, not use, to lean into the relationships that I have in that world, to try to paint a picture of Jesus Christ, who lays down his life for his enemy, and who really does believe in the power of grace and forgiveness and kindness and mercy. So I think my responsibility is to try to figure out how to use the relational equity that I've built up in this world, and be honest with those folks. I know that's not enough, but that's where I'm beginning, at least, I think. Shaul.
No, I like that. I was trying to listen as I was trying to think. Uh, everybody has different, everyone's positioned very differently in terms of, who they are and what they are. And I'm a bit older than both of you. So I feel like, my time is limited. And I feel like there's been, for me, a and it's true of all religious traditions. It's certainly true of Judaism. History has not been very kind to Jews and Judaism over the course of the last 2 millennia, and part of the product of that is a certain kind of corruption of a wisdom tradition. And I think that living in America, and with that kind of privilege, and even with rising cases of anti-Semitism, we live with immense privilege in America as Jews and as Christians and as Muslims, to be able to kind of erase the erasure of things that have been kind of put away because they didn't actually work within a particular world that was interested in its survival. And I feel like part of my job, and this was part of the Exile book and part of the work that I'm doing now, is basically going back and reviving these lost traditions, whether it be the prophetic tradition, but not only, certain cases, mystical traditions, Hasidic traditions, both revive and radically reinterpret those traditions to conform to a reality which they were totally unaware of and could not even have imagined. And it really, for me, again, I think the planetary global nature of it is really primary, that we have to work as a human race. And if we don't, then I don't care which religion is true, or we're all going to be dead. And so I think that we need to break down some of those barriers between the traditions that have developed over time for all kinds of historical reasons, understandable historical reasons. And, America, the American experiment in all its, in all of its, with all of the caveats and with all of the things that are wrong with it, it really does offer an opportunity, the freedom and the opportunity to do that. So I think that it really is, solidarity is really actually the wave of the future.
I love the idea of radically reinterpreting and reviving resources within the tradition. That should have been my answer. I'll ditto that. Okay, everyone, what you got?
Joey does edit the podcast, so potentially, Shaul, this conversation may not actually happen in the way that you thought it happened.
Yeah. No,
That,
I mean, can I just say,
of course.
I really do. I mean, I don't really have the opportunity to speak to a Muslim audience, and I think that, as a Jew, as a person that's deeply engaged and embedded in the tradition and teaches the tradition, I think that for many of us, our hands are out to that community, to work together to try to fix this mess. And I think that there's an incredible amount of resources and wisdom and knowledge that we can pull together.
Yeah, absolutely. Absolutely. I agree with that. And I think that in America, with everything despite everything that's happening in the United States right now, that is a source of concern and a source of worry. I think the reason that it's a source of concern and worry is because of my attachment to this country. It is our country, and it is our home, and we don't want to see it sullied in any way, brought down, brought low. We want to see it thrive, and we want to see it continue to thrive in ways that are responsible and principled and dignified and good. And so for me, honestly, it's a question I think about a lot. One of the answers, I think I'll give two answers. I think the first is to be present, and I don't mean it in a simplistic or crude sense, but in the sense that I should show up in ways that I can show up in. So I think that's a civic and a moral obligation right now, that we all have different strengths. I have particular areas of focus and expertise. Everyone does. Am I offering those? But the second is one that I got from, he's not a young man anymore, but I suppose neither am I. We were in Manhattan, and I was telling him how frustrated I was that I was getting a lot of blowback from the Muslim community for some of the positions I'd taken in the past. And I said, look, I gave my whole life to these communities. I've worked for years and years and years to try to represent us, to push back against Islamophobia, to help bring about what I thought would be a better American foreign policy, what have you. And he's a more spiritually inclined person. And he said, well, if you were doing it because it was the right thing to do, then you shouldn't care how people respond. But if you were doing it because you wanted people to respond in a certain way, then you would care. And it was one of those instances where someone gives you a little bit of tough love, but I appreciate that. And I think the reason I'm coming back to that is I think being present also means being present in places and spaces where there is no reward and there's no feedback. There's no audience that gives you an applause. There's no students who sign up for the course. And I love that. I'm not knocking that in the least, but also can I be in places where I might manifestly disagree with what everyone's saying, and nevertheless, I have to be there. I should be there. And my not being there is perhaps an act of ego, perhaps it's an act of cowardice. I don't know, but it doesn't help anyone. And I certainly think that's part of the problem that maybe a lot of Democrats suffered over the last few years, is that we disappeared from spaces where we could have just listened and paid attention and communicated that we cared. And I think that for people of privilege, Shaul, I hear exactly what you're saying, that it's important to show up in those respects too, that if we have opportunities, how are we turning them around, giving them back? So this is a very long answer to my own question, but I suppose there's some reasonableness in that.
Yeah, it's very interesting when I attended the campus anti-war demonstrations at Harvard, and I was at NYU, I was at Columbia one day, and people in my community will say to me that, oh, you're pro-Palestinian. And I said, what does that actually mean? I'm pro-Palestinian. I'm like if somebody is anti-racist, are they pro-black? Like if somebody is, against anti-Semitism, are they pro-Jewish? No, I'm pro-equality and justice. I'm pro being a human being. And it's a way in which this idea of everything is, if you do this, then you're that. The very idea of somebody saying to someone like me, I'm being pro-Palestinian, means I'm being a self-hating Jew. Right, mm-hmm. Because there's one or the other. Like there isn't any difference. Either you defend the war in Gaza or you're pro Hamas. You've heard that, I'm sure, many, many times. And it's just about actually trying to be a human being and treat other people as human beings in an equal way. And I don't know why that's so difficult to assess, because in a way we all kind of fall without even knowing it. We fall into this Carl Schmitt view. It's just friend or enemy. It's one or the other. That's all it is. Those are the only two options, and nothing moves forward at that point. On some weird level, we're with all of the stuff we're involved in, we're kind of engaged in a war of religion against itself, and it's. I see myself, and both of you and many others who listen are kind of soldiers in this humanistic religious outlook that's trying to basically win out over another religious outlook.
Yeah, it's something that I come back to a lot, is that so in Islam and in Revelation, Sharia, there's a concept called Huquq al-Ibad, the rights of the servant, or the the rights of the person, and hukuk-ullah, the rights of God. And of course, the question is, well, how does one infringe on or meet the rights of God? And God locates some of those rights in those servants who are not able to represent themselves, right? And underlying all of that is this idea, and it resonates, Shaul, with the idea of desecration of God's name, for example, that no matter what our particular stance, there are always certain red lines. And we may not like someone, we may not like something, we may not like a certain situation, we can't cross these red lines. That no matter how much I might want a certain outcome, I can't do X, Y, or Z in order to get there, right? So we have obviously certain commitments to family and community that trump, for lack of a better term, other commitments, but that doesn't then allow us to go and step on other people in the process, right? So I can give, my kid my all to help them get into, let's say, a good college or find a job. I can't subvert someone else in that process. I can't discount someone else in that process. And I think that's, in that sense, it is a kind of corruption of religion versus what I believe religion actually is, which is honoring what has been made and the purposes for which these things have been made and our space within that cosmic reality.
Our second episode featured Shadi Hamid, author, foreign policy commentator, and Washington Post columnist. He discussed the war in Gaza through his particular lens. We invited Shaul on to continue and extend that conversation, which lets you know where we're going with Avenue M. We will continue to host remarkable guests to offer us deep dives into a range of topics, but we'll punctuate these episodes with conversations with Cincinnati faith leaders, like Adam Franchek, pastor of Knox Presbyterian, who is our guest next week. Harun and I will also introduce episodes where we unpack the topics that move us, the questions that drive us, and revisit themes and concerns that speak to us where we are, balancing the local and the global, the immediate and the transcendent. We're making this shift because that's what we believe our faith calls us to. Thanks for listening, and thanks to Zach Swellbar for recording our theme music. If you enjoyed this episode, please don't forget to like and subscribe, and let us know what questions we should be asking and who else we should be talking to.